I work at the Academy Film Archive in Los Angeles, where we have Chick Strand's collection, about maybe 100 other experimental filmmakers in the collection there, and that's primarily what I work on. And so I'm sorry I couldn't be here to introduce the program, but I had to be in the competition program because I'm supposed to be jurying the films. And so I want to thank L'Ajador and Philippe and Olivier for letting me do this, because it is really a great pleasure of what I do to get to put together some films to bring to an audience, no matter where it is, that maybe hasn't had the chance to see these films. And Chick Strand is somebody who, because I've been in California since 1990, when my parents and I moved from the Northeast in the U.S., and I moved to the Bay Area, San Francisco area, where Chick was still kind of a big name, even though she left there in the mid-'60s. And I worked at Canyon Cinema, which is a distributor of experimental film, and she was one of our very favorite people, and we loved her films. And I just had this sense, as somebody in my early 20s, that she was super famous. Like, everybody knew Chick Strand's films, just like they know Brackage or Kenneth Anger or something. And then I came to LA, where she actually lived, and of course everybody knew her there. And so it just kept seeming to me that she was this really well-known filmmaker. But then gradually, the more I talked to people outside of California, even in New York, I realized that she was pretty unknown. And people had read about her, maybe, but they hadn't really seen her films. And, I mean, they weren't hard to get. They weren't unavailable. They were totally available. But somehow she never really was very well known. And this started to change, I think, in the mid-2000s, so only about 10 years ago. And she died, I think it was in 2009. And it's one of those things where typically an artist, a really great artist who maybe wasn't appreciated in their time as much as they should be, maybe in some ways because she was very ahead of her time, I think, and very radical for her time. In the time since she died, she started to really grow in notoriety and in stature. I mean, we just did a year ago a very big retrospective at the Tate Modern in London, which probably she would have been blown away, like that happened, because yeah, really, in her lifetime she wasn't known like that. So that's another reason why this is really exciting for me. And so I wanted to finish this really dark, heavy, complicated program with this last film to give you at least a little bit of simple pleasure after, I think, a program filled with pleasure, but very complex pleasure. This program for me was about the incredible complexity and multiplicity of meanings in the images that we consume, in a way, and like how one image can mean so many things. And she's like a master at putting these things together to create like a result that's really, really, it's not clearly symbolic in some simple readable way. It's really complicated, it's really dense, sometimes it's very mysterious, impossible to summarize. Else Van Riel, who was in this program last night, she was asking me today, which was the one called Elasticity? What happens in that film? And in a way, I couldn't describe to her. Well, it's got a big guy kind of dancing at the end, and I couldn't come up with a simple way to remind her of which film it was in the program, because in a way it blends together, and these images, and in fact that film and also Loose Ends in many ways are about the images that create our worlds. And I think Loose Ends is sort of very much looking out, and Elasticity, she's very much looking at herself. So which is why I wanted to put these two together. But I don't know if anybody has any questions. I'm happy to try to answer them if you do. But I don't know, I don't want to just keep going on and on to you either. I definitely recommend, if you are going to be here, I think it's on Monday, the other Chick Strand film. Yeah, okay, this guy knows. The other program has only 3 films, but I think there's 3 incredibly powerful films of hers, including the film Soft Fiction, which was a special request of Olivier to program, because it's a completely amazing masterpiece, I think. So please do come to that if you can. It's again, it's impossible to summarize in a simple way. It's very much about survival, about desire, about women, and the strength of women, and she was really concerned with that in her films. She was an incredibly feminist filmmaker who sometimes in her career was criticized by, in the 70s, she was kind of criticized by like hardcore kind of party line feminists. So she has this kind of interesting history of being not always an orthodox feminist, but nevertheless being a pretty radical feminist regardless. And you probably can tell that in her films, whether it's in found footage or footage that she's shot, there's a lot of very deep identification with her female characters and the women that she's depicting in her films. And even in this way that I think, like this, the older woman in the footage in Mexico in Elasticity at the beginning, like when I see these films, because I got to work with her and know her, and we talked a little bit about this stuff. I know that she's putting herself on this woman like that. She's saying, "That's me, that's me." In Loose Ends, when this poor kind of clumsy girl comes into the classroom in that section of an educational film, Ada Adams, that's also Chick. Like Chick is also seeing her. She's the teacher, but she's also this fucked up student that doesn't really know how to like be comfortable with herself. And so there's this such a rich projection that she has, and because of that, her films have so much empathy and feeling, and often are about empathy, I think, in a way that I can't think of another filmmaker that does it with such complexity and genuine feeling. So it's so she's very special, I think. So anyway, yeah.
I said, I was just wondering if you could just, if you know, like the kind of, I guess, the nature of the text, especially like in Elasticity, like
The text.
Yeah, like I mean, these some of these lines are really amazing.
Yeah.
On their own. So, is that all her writing?
No. Well, I don't exactly know
here and
a
there,
lot of
or-
times. She was a collagist more
Yeah.
than anything, in a way.
Right.
And the way that, like in Elasticity, sometimes you're not entirely positive if she shot something or if she found some footage. And it's a way of kind of evening out that stuff. Like, so you, like whether it's shot or whether it's found, she's making it not matter sometimes. And it's the same with the texts. Like sometimes there's some speaking and there's subtitles and it's actually translating. Sometimes it's not translating. Like in Elasticity, at the beginning, obviously many of you are French speakers here, so you know that it's not always exact translation of what the subtitle it says. And at one point she's taking lines from Last Year at Marienbad in Loose Ends, where it's talking about the empty halls and galleries and balustrades and all that. And so, yeah, it's like a collage of all this stuff. Like sometimes, she's doing it with the music too. Sometimes, like she's combining different music. I actually used, I don't know, do you have the app Shazam? You know, where you can like, you use this app, and when some music is playing, it'll tell you what song it is if the song is in the database. It's kind of amazing. And so sometimes when I'm working on sound restoration, I'll do that with the soundtracks of these filmmakers just to see what are they using. And with Chick, it's always something crazy. Like it's just a little piece of a Jade Warrior song. Jade Warrior was like a progressive rock band from the mid-70s. Like just a section, like maybe 20 seconds, and then that goes into some like gamelan music, or she's maybe doing two things at once. Like, and she's doing that with the texts, the images. So it's because it's all kind of filtered through her consciousness. She's just taking little things that suit her in that way. So. Yeah, so the simple answer is I really have no idea which ones are hers and which aren't. Yeah, even this thing about amnesia, euphoria, and ecstasy, I'm not even positive that, I don't know if anybody knows. I think she wrote that. I'm not even sure, though. It's probably from something, I don't know. Yeah, or it might be adapted from something she read. Yeah. But she had a huge library. She had a huge VHS and DVD collection. She watched movies all the time. She read all the time. She was very, very... cultured in that way, and just knew so many interesting people, and so she just absorbed all this stuff and then would kind of spew it out into these really complex films about the human condition. So yeah, so if there are no other questions, it's totally okay, but
since you're talking about this collage process, according to you, what holds it together?
what holds it together?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe the easy answer is she holds it together, like her consciousness and identity, because the films to me are very much, they're very, very, the subjectivity of the films is very deep and very prominent. Like you really feel like it's her view of something. And part of it's the formal approach, like the collage, the interventions, the mixing of, like at the beginning of Elasticity, it's a sequence in Mexico with this old woman, but it's Japanese music and speech, and it's kind of like I mean, a very, very obvious collage. So yeah, I feel like what really, I mean, when you make a collage yourself, I mean, she's also a surrealist in a lot of ways. She identified as a surrealist, and so I think, like if you think of Max Ernst or an artist like that, or even Bruce Conner, who was doing collages in the 60s in the style of Max Ernst, it's kind of tapping into the subconscious a little bit, and just the weird connections we're making between things that are not always easy to understand, but they have some weird power. And I think she was really interested in that, the idea of the exquisite corpse and collage as like a manifestation of the subconscious, maybe, if that makes sense. So, so her collage style, I think, is not very literal. It's not very conscious. It's very intuitive, and it's subconscious more. And which is why a film like Loose Ends doesn't make very clear, obvious sense. It's meant to be a upsetting, confusing film, because if it made perfect sense, then it would lose a lot of its power, I think. So I hope that makes sense. Anyway, but I'm around till Tuesday, and please try to come to the other program if you can. There's also a fantastic program, again, I forget, you have the schedule, I forget when it is, of these two films called Sweet California by Robert Nelson, and these are really, really rarely shown films, but I think it's, again, kind of a masterpiece. It's a very subjective travelogue of California. So it's kind of like literally a travelogue in some ways, like visiting parts of California, Southern California, and then Central California. But it's also filtered through his conscious, his memories, his experiences. It's actually quite funny in a lot of parts, and quite moving and weird and beautiful. So I highly recommend that if you can check it out. And then, yeah, and if you have questions or want to ask me anything, I'll be around. So thanks.
Just how did she get funding, or how was
funding?
she supported for these kind of so personal and
well, I mean, sometimes she got grants. It's funny, Elasticity, when I first got her films, maybe in 2006, I started going through all the original negatives and stuff, and I think 4 of the films were labeled Elasticity Part 1, Elasticity Part 2, Part 3, like that. But only one of them was actually the film Elasticity. The others were like Mujer de Mil Fuegos and some of the other titles. And so I called her and I said, hey, why are all these things labeled Elasticity? And she laughed and she said, I got a grant from, I think it was the AFI, but it was only a grant for a feature film. So I just lied and I told them that all these were parts of a feature film so I could get the grant. And so she like called it Elasticity for the lab, like the laboratory, just in case like AFI, they would see the bills for the lab and it all said the same title. So, but yeah, from like nonprofit organizations, and also from, she was a teacher, and so she made a little money. Her husband was a kind of a little bit well-known painter named Neon Park. And so they weren't super poor. I mean, like middle class, I would say.
yeah, because
but,
everything's made on film.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, they're not super expensive films to make. She also, one of her students, his father was some really high up guy at Disney. And so somehow through him, she was able to get access to tons of found footage, like from the Disney archives or something like that. Like she was able to sort of like copy whatever she wanted, like through this guy who was her student. So it's, yeah, so she, whatever she could like use to take advantage of that, she did it. She's very, very resourceful. She was not going to be defeated.
Thank you.